The basic question we're asking in this paper is what sort of institutional setting is going to best induce a sort of equilibrium, good response or desirable response to rogue states. And so, of course, we're particularly motivated by the run-up to the Second Iraq War, and so we're particularly interested in focusing on sort of a stronger version of the UN versus a weaker version of the UN. So first I'm going to present a general model. I'm going to present some results on a sort of anarchic, or two anarchic baselines, where we're sort of looking at decentralized or uncoordinated responses of individual states to a rogue state. And then we're going to look at possible coordinated responses through some sort of simple abstractions that you might think of as capturing some key features of the UN Security Council decision-making process. So we're going to look at a stronger version of this abstracted UN, where you have basically some sort of unanimity rule framework where if everybody agrees that there should be some coordinated response to the rogue state, then there's an opportunity for states to join in a sort of approved and legitimated enforcing coalition. And then a weaker version of the United Nations where even if unanimity is not satisfied, even if some member states vote no, there's still a possibility of forming a breakaway coalition of the willing in which states who wish to coordinate their response can do so. So the coordination, or the coalition of the willing, of course, is a term of art that was, I think, coined by Clinton during the international intervention into Bosnia, and of course was revived in the Second Iraq War. And these issues are still very much before us as we think about the international response to Syria and Russian opposition to any kind of UN coordinated sanctions, or when we think about North Korea. And until recently, China has been putting the brakes on any effort to coordinate sanctions through the UN there. Some views from the trenches on the United Nations and its desirable or undesirable effects. So, on one hand, we have John Bolton and the neoconservatives in the United States. John Bolton was the permanent representative to the UN from the United States during the Bush administration. So the argument there was basically, well, the UN is an ineffective and possibly even counterproductive framework for international responses to rogue states. And there were basically two main complaints. One was that it can leave the ultimate outcome in the hands of less affected states, perhaps even states who are benefiting in some way from the rogue states' undesirable behavior. And so that undermines the ability of the most adversely affected members of the UN to take action to protect their own national interests. And the second complaint was that the UN decision-making process was essentially revealing a lot of information to the rogue states, which the rogue state could then turn around and effectively exploit to its advantage, possibly even making it more aggressive. Blair articulated a very different position on the UN. He said, sure, sometimes it produces suboptimal outcomes, but on the whole it's a good thing and we should attempt to bolster it, not to undermine it. And he criticized the coalition of the willing because, the breakaway coalition, because he said this is going to create incentives for other states to join that coalition and to bypass the UN, and that's ultimately undermining the UN as an institution. Of course, in spite of those critiques of the whole idea of the breakaway coalition, Blair's UK did join the breakaway coalition nonetheless. One of the things that we find in the work that I'm about to present is that strictly voluntary coalitions of the willing may include states that are essentially compelled to join in order to show support, even though they would prefer that the possibility of such a coalition not exist at all. So let me just start sketching the basic model that we employ here. So states are going to differ in their privately known underlying costs that they suffer as a result of the rogue state's behavior, and they're going to choose their actions in order to minimize those costs, anticipating how the rogue state is going to interpret their actions or interpret their resolve. We're going to focus on how the incentives under different institutional environments affect the nature and informativeness of the signals that that the non-rogue state's actions are sending to the rogue state. And then we're going to try to recover some intuitions that I just discussed from the views from the trenches, from Bolton and from Blair, and perhaps add some nuance to some of their complaints and actions. I would be remiss if I didn't mention some related literatures in international relations. Three particularly relevant and strong ones are on the circumstances that lend credibility to states' threats to escalate military conflicts. Another literature on the politics in and around the UN Security Council and its decision-making process, and of course on collective action problems in forming alliances. We're going to abstract away from the issues that are raised in all of these literatures. So these things are certainly relevant and they're out there, but that's not something we're going to discuss. What was that, Alistair? So we have players, we have N normal states, if you will, and a rogue state R. The normal states will be indexed 1 through N. The rogue state benefits from taking some provocative action, but it may also incur costs that are imposed by other states on it as a result of that provocative action. Each of the normal states is going to have a cost parameter, which is basically scaling that state's disutility from the rogue state's action. So those things are private information of those states, but there's a common knowledge prior distribution, right, about what the types of those normal states are. And just assume some nice distribution. The key feature, though, is that the mass of states with types less than 0 must be less than 1/2. So we're generally thinking of normal states as suffering disutility from the rogue state's actions. We're leaving open the possibility that there are states that actually benefit from the rogue state's actions, though. So the two main institutional environments we're interested in here we're going to call the strong United Nations and the weak United Nations. In the strong United Nations, UN member states vote by a unanimity rule. So of course we have the Security Council in the back of our heads here. And this is, we just want to keep the model very simple. So we're basically going to treat the UN as if it were the permanent members of the Security Council. So the UN member states vote by unanimity rule on whether to authorize action against the rogue state. If the vote succeeds, right, everyone votes yes, then the states can voluntarily choose whether or not to join the UN enforcing coalition that actually imposes sanctions and bears costs for imposing those sanctions. If the vote fails, then the coalition does not form. Okay. So essentially here we're sort of have a black box assumption here that violating the UN vote by going ahead and having a coalition impose sanctions anyway is somehow too costly for those states, so that's not something they want to do. And the other version of this is a weak United Nations, which is one where it's possible to have these breakaway coalitions. So the UN member states vote, again by unanimity rule, on whether or not to authorize action against the rogue state. If the vote succeeds, then the states once again choose voluntarily whether or not to join a UN enforcing coalition that will impose sanctions on the rogue state. If the vote fails, then states can choose whether to join a breakaway coalition that will impose sanctions on the rogue state. The technology in the model, the technology of the coalition is exactly the same, whether there's unanimous support for the coalition or not. So only the words used to describe them are different, but the technology for imposing sanctions as a coalition is exactly the same. So sequence of play. So the international community, this is the very broad sequence of play. The international community is going to coordinate on sanctions for the rogue state, conditional on the kind of institutional environment that they're in. The rogue state is going to observe the choices made by the other states. So in the case of the strong UN model, the rogue state is going to observe the UN vote. It's going to observe, how many voted in favor of sanctions and how many voted against. And is going to observe the number of participants in the enforcing coalition if it's authorized. In the case of the weak UN, the rogue state is going to observe the outcome of the UN vote, the vote tally once again, how many in favor and how many against, the number of participants in the enforcing coalition if it's authorized, and if it's not authorized, it's going to observe the number of participants in the breakaway coalition. And then the rogue state is going to choose its level of action A, and the sanctions will be realized. So we're abstracting away from a lot of things here. Let me run through just a handful of them. So first of all, the rogue state moves second in this model. We're treating it as a common knowledge situation that the rogue state wants to take this aggressive action. So we're sort of picking up the situation from, we all know that the rogue state wants to do this provocative thing. And the question is, right, once states, have their process, right, and decide how they're going to respond to that rogue state, then what does the rogue state do? What level of provocative action will it ultimately choose after it understands what the international response is going to be? We're assuming heterogeneity in the normal state's costs from the rogue action, right? How much they dislike it, how much disutility they suffer from it, but they are going to be identical in size and capability. Right? So we're completely abstracting away from, the difference between, the superpower, as it were, and a smaller nation, a less economically powerful nation, or less militarily powerful nation. So we're abstracting away from those issues completely here. We're not allowing side payments between the non-rogue states. Obviously, a lot of that goes on in the world as well. I think it's obvious anyway. And we're assuming unanimity voting rules in the UN, although, of course, the UN is a much more complicated decision-making structure than that. This is the stylization we're running with here. So this is purely authorization in this model. So again, obviously the world is more complicated. With respect to the unanimity voting rules in the UN, we could change this to a Q rule, right? You're going to shift, some pivot points and things, but and make the analysis a lot more complicated. But the basic incentive structures that we're going to be examining here, those incentives are going to carry through. So we're opting to keep this simple in lots of ways. And in our defense, right, before we go, I think we get something interesting out of it, even though it's so simple. So that's ultimately our defense for going with simple here. We're getting something interesting out of the simple, and if we made it more complicated, it would be harder to see what that was. Payoffs, then. So the sanctions against the rogue state are going to come in two different forms. So we're going to have alpha costs and beta costs imposed on the rogue state. The alpha costs are essentially scaling the costs that states can unilaterally, the sanctions that states unilaterally impose on the rogue state. So this doesn't it's not like the rogue state is only sanctioned or only suffers from other states' dislike of its behavior when there's some kind of enforcing coalition. States can act unilaterally here and do. So there's sort of an automatic individual sanction that states unilaterally impose. And then if they actually join together in a coalition, there's going to be some additional cost, some additional sanction scaled by beta that's imposed on the rogue state. You can think of that as how much does the bite of our sanctions increase if we actually get together and coordinate our actions in a concerted way, as opposed to each of us just taking our own individual actions against that state. The rogue state's utility then is going to be scaled by, so its own action is A. Gamma is scaling the benefit associated with its own action, so that's a positive thing. It likes to take this action A. And then we're going to subtract away from that some cost of sanctions. So T is the vector of other states' types. So the sanction that is imposed on the rogue state, right, the effective sanction, the costs that it bears, is going to be a function of the sum of other states' dislike multiplied by alpha, the unilateral sanctions, right? And how many states choose to join any kind of coalition against it, right? The more states join, the more costs are imposed, scaled by beta, and all that's multiplied. Is going to depend, of course, also on the provocativeness of its own action. So the more aggressive it is, the higher action A is, the more severe the costs that are going to be imposed on it. All right, and then we have the non-rogue states utility down here. So they're suffering some cost minus TI times A from the rogue state's action, where TI is their own type. And if they choose to join the coalition, in that case WI is 1, that's their choice variable, then they're also paying a cost delta A, right, of joining the coalition. So it's that cost of joining the coalition is independent of their own type, but it does depend on how aggressive the rogue state's action is. So if the rogue state is more aggressive, those who are joining the coalition are going to be paying a higher cost, right, of being in that coalition and opposing. Yes? Let's think about the rogue state's problem then. In either of these institutional environments, the strong UN or the weak UN, right, suppose that K is the number of non-rogue states that are participating in a coalition. So in the case of a strong UN, that coalition can form only if there's been a unanimous vote in favor of allowing the coalition to form. Right? And then K is the number of nations that have voluntarily chosen to join that enforcing coalition. If the institutional environment is the weak UN, right, then again, if it's a unanimous vote in favor of having a coalition impose sanctions, then K is the number of nations that choose to join that enforcing coalition. If there's been a less than unanimous vote, that's to say the measure failed, then K is going to be the number of nations who choose to join the breakaway coalition. Okay. And to try to keep things succinct on the slides, I'm going to use K as the number of nations in the coalition in all of these various cases. So K is the number of nations in the coalition. So the expected utility of the rogue state then from taking action A is going to be its benefit gamma A minus this term that scales the expected size of the sanction times A squared. Right, so the sanction is going to be alpha times the expected sum of types, given the information that's been revealed in this decision-making process, revealed by the vote tally, revealed by the number of nations in the coalition, and beta times the number of nations in the coalition. Right. So we can just go through whatever our institutional environment is. We can just think of this term as a sanction, a measure of the size of the sanction that's imposed. And then the optimal rogue action here, right, if the sanction is a positive one, right, is going to be this, and it's going to be their maximal action A otherwise. The non-rogue states problem then, given the vote, is going to be whether or not to join the coalition in cases where a coalition is permitted, either an enforcing coalition because there was unanimous approval of imposing sanctions, or in the case of the weak UN, right, and a non-unanimous approval, right, a losing measure, their decision to join the breakaway coalition or not. So here, state participates in the coalition, whatever sort of coalition it is, if and only if this is true. You'll notice that this means that the non-rogue states' actions, their decision to join the coalition or not, is monotonic in type. So we're going to have some cut point T hat such that all the types higher than T hat want to join the coalition, all types lower than T hat do not. And we have two kinds of informative, symmetric, perfect Bayesian equilibria then in this model. One in which only sufficiently negative types join the coalition, and they do so in order to encourage higher rogue state action. And the other one is in which only sufficiently positive types join the coalition in order to discourage the rogue state action. Right. So these are both signaling equilibria. They're both symmetric. Right. We can't use the Pareto refinement because this is a distributional issue between states. So we're using the highly controversial substantive non-stupidity refinement to limit our attention for the rest of the paper on the second one, since the first one here essentially means that the fellow travelers of the rogue state, those who benefit from the rogue state's actions, hit it over the head, which is costly for them, in order to send the rogue state a costly, credible message that they like what it's doing and it should do more. So that's bizarre. So we're going to stick with the equilibrium in which it's the states who are harmed by the rogue state's actions, who take actions, costly actions, which actually harm the rogue state and thus discourage it. In equilibrium, states' decisions to join the enforcing coalition under either the strong UN or the weak UN, or a coalition of the willing under the weak UN, are weakly increasing in type. I thought I just... And right? So we have this condition that's going to identify the lowest type that joins the coalition. In any informative equilibrium, the rogue state's action is going to be weakly decreasing in this sanction, right? In this measure of sanction S, right? And thus in K, the number of states joining the coalition. And it's also going to be weakly convex in that measure of sanction, right? And so weakly convex in K. So this gets back, finally, took a little longer than I thought it would, sorry, finally gets back to your question. So under the strong UN, state I is going to vote to authorize sanctions, authorize a coalition enforcing sanctions, if and only if its type is positive. Right? And so then we've got a sanction, if the vote was unanimous in favor of the enforcing coalition, and we have this level of sanction if it's not. Under the weak UN, where we allow the possibility of breakaway coalitions of the willing. So the possible, sorry, that BI should be a WI, but states' decisions to participate or not participate in a breakaway coalition following a non-unanimous vote to obtain UN authorization, right? It's basically the same sort of calculation that we did before. So once again, the state's going to vote to authorize only if its type is positive. And in this case, the voting is essentially cheap talk, unlike the strong UN, because they can still join a breakaway coalition using exactly the same technology that they used before. So I see the 5-minute sign go up, so let me hurry a bit. We have two different anarchic baselines, which are basically just for comparison's sake, for welfare comparisons. So we have one without communication and one with cheap talk communication. The cheap talk communication is allowing us to hold fixed the effects of communication when we compare it to the weak UN. So we can look at just the effects of allowing coalition formation. So once again, in the unique informative equilibrium under the anarchic baseline with communication, types greater than 0 separate from types less than 0, just like in the weak UN and the strong UN. But now the expected action of the rogue state is going to be higher when we allow cheap talk than when we don't. Let's think about the ex-ante welfare comparisons between these, the baselines and the UNs. So if there is a state that is a negative type, so it actually likes what the rogue state is doing, then the strong UN and the anarchic baseline of communication yield equivalent outcomes, because basically both of them allow the same level of communication, and neither one of them is going to allow any kind of coalition to form when there's somebody who votes no in the UN. The equilibrium expected rogue state action is going to be higher under both the strong UN and the weak UN than under the anarchic baseline of communication, as long as we have sufficiently low values of beta. So basically what's happening here is if coordinating our actions doesn't produce a sufficiently large increase in the sanctions felt by, or the damage done by the sanctions for the rogue state, then the dominant effect is going to be the informational one, right? And that benefits the rogue state in expectation and hurts the non-rogue states. So let's think about the comparison of the strong and weak UN. If states unanimously authorize the enforcing coalition, then they're going to yield the same outcomes. But if the enforcing coalition is not unanimously authorized, then the equilibrium expected rogue state action is actually higher under the weak UN, where coalitions are still allowed to form, than under the strong UN, again for sufficiently low values of beta. So this is again a situation where the informational effect is dominating the effect of the additional sanctions of coordination. So if not all the states vote in favor of the sanctions, then the set of states is going to be partitioned into two groups under the strong UN, those who voted yes and those who voted no. But under the weak UN, it's going to be partitioned into three sets. So those who voted no, those who voted yes but chose not to join the coalition, and those who voted yes and did vote the coalition. So what's happening there is the weak UN is actually revealing more information to the rogue state, which the rogue state can then exploit, than the strong UN does. So there's a tension here in the neocons' complaints about the UN. On the one hand, they complain that the UN decision-making process is revealing too much information to the rogue state. On the other hand, they're saying we ought to make it easier to have breakaway coalitions, to allow coalitions to form even without the UN authorization, because otherwise some states' foreign policy is held hostage by less adversely affected states, and so they're not able to pursue their own national security interests adequately. So these two things are in tension. As you allow breakaway coalitions to more easily form, you're also providing more information to the rogue state. And the minimum type that joins the breakaway coalition of the willing under the weak UN is going to be lower than the minimum type that would join a unanimously authorized enforcement coalition under either weak UN or strong UN. So, and the minimum type that joins the breakaway coalition of the willing is decreasing as the number of states that vote against authorization gets larger. So basically what's happening here is by having a failed vote, or a vote that fails unexpectedly, badly, that's sending an emboldening signal to the rogue state, right? The opposition against you is not as strong as you had probably expected it to be, so the rogue state will be bolder in its actions, and that actually causes more of the states who are adversely affected by the rogue state's actions to want to join a coalition that can suppress that action. Right? So it increases the benefits to them of joining such a coalition, even as that coalition essentially becomes less effective. Right? I'm going to look at, this is a less interesting case where beta is small. This is sort of something that can happen with intermediate values of beta, and this is, I think, the most interesting one. So let me do this one last slide before I cede the floor. So let's think about the interim welfare effect. So suppose you're a state that knows your type, you know how adversely you're affected by rogue state actions, and you're in a situation here where the expected rogue state action is equilibrium, given that you know that you at least will join the coalition, right? That's going to be a lower rogue state action than the rogue state action that would take place under a strong UN, and that's going to be lower than the expected action when you know that at least one state would not join. That's to say, you know that you're a type that wouldn't join. You don't know what states other types are, but you know that if a coalition forms, you won't be joining it, right? And that will embolden the rogue state relative to how bold it would be under the strong UN when breakaway coalitions were not permitted. So looking at this diagram here, so this is type. T hat is the smallest value of non-rogue state that would join a breakaway coalition under the weak UN. And T double hat is the minimum type of coalition that would prefer, that is against the rogue state's actions, that's adversely affected by it, that would actually prefer the weak UN to the strong UN. So what's going on here is basically the guys in here are adversely affected by the rogue state's action. They know that the rogue state's action will be lower if you allow breakaway coalitions than if you do not, because they know that they themselves would be willing to join a breakaway coalition if such a breakaway coalition were possible. And yet they actually prefer the strong UN to the weak UN, because the additional cost that they have to bear of joining that coalition, and they will join under the weak UN, they will join the breakaway coalition, but the cost that they have to bear from doing so isn't really enough to compensate them for the difference in the rogue state's action under the strong UN and under the weak UN. But they will take it if we're in the weak UN, because at that point, right, the rogue state has been emboldened. If they don't join the breakaway coalition, that's like sending a signal to the rogue state that they don't find sanctions all that objectionable, right? They're not willing to oppose it, right? That their own individual sanctions won't even be that high. So these are sort of compelled participants, right? Kind of like Blair's United Kingdom, right? They prefer to have a strong UN. They would rather that breakaway coalitions not be possible. But once it becomes clear that a breakaway coalition is a possibility, they're unwilling to sit on the sidelines because they know that doing so is going to be sending the wrong kind of signal to the rogue state and will further embolden the rogue state. So instead they join that breakaway coalition, even though in some sense they would be better off if it did not exist at all.